Who's got it? Great. Okay, welcome to this Beyond Return Salon. We're talking about the role of consciousness raising in linking the personal to the political. So personal transformation is ineffective when attempted in isolation. In our individualistic society, we rely too much on self-care, self-help, personal responsibility, and personal growth without always considering the broader cultural and societal processes and communities that individuals inhabit.
In the 1960s and 70s, countercultural groups used consciousness raising to achieve personal and cultural transformation at the same time. The value of these groups was that they addressed the personal and the political simultaneously, achieving what one might call transpersonal transformation. So in recent times, there's been a renewed interest in both self-improvement and healing and societal transformation. And this is why we're talking about consciousness raising.
Yeah, so today we're sort of asking how in this context might consciousness raising groups approach healing ourselves and the world at the same time. Is there ways to make mutual support circles a common feature of people's lives, something that any of us can set up and do, and how can online tools help us? So I just want to start with this quote that for me, I think motivates a lot of the things that I do. It's from Power Makes Us Sick. Self-care cannot cure social diseases. What is next? Social diseases work their way into and between us. Sorry about Hate Street. Social diseases work their way into and between us. We must contend with the urge to take care of ourselves and to immunize against one another's bodies. To isolate us is the tactic of our enemy. The power of the state, the omnipresence of it, diminishes every time we look into the eyes of a friend, of a stranger, and listen to what they need. As we listen, we slip out of the regimes of extractive time and impatience. Fuck the fake heartbeat of clocks. Every time we educate ourselves and opt for the teacher and the classroom that does not require pay, we strengthen horizontally and we heal by putting no one under. Healing is honoring that resistance is a slow process and declaring that we desire to see the increased strength, vitality, and well-being of our friends, neighbors, and comrades, and full social ecologies more than we desire to see the state at all. There is no one person that deserves the cold shoulder as much as the state's austere violences. In this condition, it shrinks, it desiccates. We share informal, illegal, and decentralized forms of care like they are the very waters which support a life in common, because they are. So I think this quote's really nice because it really speaks to the sort of the tiny, the tiny sort of practices and praxis that we can take on a daily basis. That if we all start to do them, like really builds sort of collective power. So one of the goals of Beyond Return is to link the everyday to the political, and consciousness raising is about linking the personal and the political. All too often in the US, we focus on individuals and individual actions, and we fail to look at the broader context that we live in that make us the way we are. Consciousness raising is an approach that balances these forces and allows us to look at ourselves in the context of a group and broader society. And this comes from a desire to change the way we're thinking about the world and about what we are doing in the world. To start from our experience and emotional states, to foreground issues like anxiety and subjectivity, and to make those things a key part of and starting place for our strategy, and to have that inform our actions and praxis.
So there's something really radical, as Zarina's getting at here, about healing together. So many of us are carrying all of this trauma and pain and grief and the weight of oppression, and we carry this with us all the time. And in many cases, we pass this on. It's something that sort of resounds around social space and cultural space. And as a culture, we need to get better. And that itself is a political project. And there's more and more people, I think, becoming invested in this view of sort of personal, mental, and emotional well-being becoming a site of political transformation. But to be a feminist, one first has to become one. This is one of the opening sentences of Sandra Lee Bartke's seminal essay on feminist consciousness. So in the early days of gay liberation and second wave feminism, as Laura was talking about earlier, it was generally well understood that we, people living in advanced industrial societies, with their deeply rooted norms, had internalized many of the oppressive values of those societies. If we were going to change the world, therefore, we were going to have to change ourselves in the process. So for this reason, the gay liberation and women's movements practiced what they called consciousness raising, in which members of a community, whether this was a commune or an activist circle or the sort of an activist or NGO or nonprofit office, such as that staffed by the Gay Liberation Front in London, they would gather together and intentionally set out to reshape their views, emotional dispositions, and desires in order to become more compassionate, fair, revolutionary, etc. Yet this practice has sort of faded out over the decades as people have become increasingly wary of having their outlooks and desires questioned, and as our culture has become increasingly individualist. But as one gay liberation front activist put it, quote, in gay consciousness raising, from each individual talking about his or her individual experience of oppression, growing up, coming out, etc., a general pattern could be discerned, and so a cognitive leap could take place in the minds of the group. They would then come to see the oppression of gay people as part of the general gender system of our society with common features despite individual idiosyncrasies. So basically making collective sense of personal experiences.
Nice. Yeah, so consciousness raising is a sort of historical tool and practice. And I'm just going to share a quote from one of the women's liberation circles, just to sort of explain what it felt like for them. We may have more formally called it consciousness raising, but in essence, we were telling each other stories to reclaim ourselves and our humanity. We created a feminist culture with these stories, not through the narratives of logic and structure, but by creating verbal snapshots of the lived experiences of women. We didn't have to all tell the same story in order to resonate with each other. Each story was unique, but the act of telling our stories created strong bonds amongst diverse women who worked together to change our realities. We could imagine a world in which women lived in freedom from violence, and we set about building rape crisis centers and domestic violence shelters, not only to help women who had been violated, but also to project a vision of what a world without violence could look like. So I think that's really important, right? It's not just recovering from the history that got us to the present, but also visioning the future as part of that.
Who's the quote from, Zarina? Sorry.
Quote is from Loretta Ross, who's the co-founder and former national coordinator of the Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective, and they're describing what consciousness raising circles were like. I can post all these quotes after for you also. So one thing to say is that consciousness raising is not therapy. Whilst these circles may have therapeutic effects, and it is very calming and restorative. If anyone's taken part in any of these circles, it's very calming and restorative to try and understand your own subjectivity, your own pain, your own experience through a collective lens with other people who've maybe experienced harm on a different sort of axis of society. But that's not the primary or only goal of these groups. They are about integrating our experiences and growing our sort of collective power. And I want to share this quote from Plan C, who are a wonderful group who've been using consciousness raising as a tool for about a year and a half. Even the most intersectionally oppressed, even the most well-read, cannot simply look inwards and draw out sufficiently correct and powerful theory. Although both the experience of oppression and the reading of books can help strengthen one's analysis in different ways, one being more pleasant than the other. Consciousness raising does not involve holding up the individual experience as truth, but collectively connecting experience to the world and transforming it into action. Experience is the raw material, but collective discussion and thought is the tool which will transform it into something capable of raising our consciousness.
Yeah, so this really flies in the face, as I mentioned a bit ago, of some of the recent trends in progressive political thinking. And here, I guess I'm referring to certain forms of identity politics, which imagine that people are bound to have the correct views on things by virtue of their belonging to a particular group. We might be encouraged by this type of politics, might be encouraged not to interrogate our views, desires, and understanding of the world because we are marginalized in some way. The problem with this, of course, is that it tends to neglect the highly political formation of desire, and also that we can change. Moreover, it fails to take into account the fact that oppressed and or subjugated people are capable themselves of effectuating further oppression and subjugation upon others. So of course, This is true for all of us. No matter how marginalized we are or may not be, our views, outlooks, desires, and even our grasp of what is possible are all forged in a deeply broken, inequitable culture. So according to the feminist philosopher Amy Srinivasan, in failing to question one's desires and outlooks, the non-self-critical political stance, quote, risks covering not only for misogyny, but for racism, ableism, transphobia, and every other oppressive system, end quote. And this makes you think of something that Michel Foucault wrote in the preface to Deleuze and Guattari's book, Anti-Oedipus, where he emphasized the importance in any political struggle of forensically locating and excising the, quote, inner fascist that one develops in their engagement with power. And it's a major theme of that book, Anti-Oedipus, to engage in this micro-political struggle with internalized political and economic regimes at that psychological level. So what makes consciousness raising so powerful is that it refuses to treat subjectivity as a fixed and static category and seeks instead to transform the way that we view ourselves or relate to each other in this world. So consciousness raising produces new subjects in collective settings. So drawing from the experience and desires of the individuals involved, the consciousness raising group attempts to produce a new intellectual, emotional, social, and sexual ecology, which becomes internalized by the individual participants. The group, rather than the individual out on their own, aims to generate a radical solidarity and new kinds of interrelation and ultimately desiring based on the aggregate experiences and desires of those present. So within these settings, imbalances, scarcities, power dynamics, surpluses, and deficits can be identified and reworked. And I just really want to emphasize that like this transpersonal approach that both takes account of the individual, but does not just treat the individual as an isolated instance, is super duper powerful. I think too much of our sort of politics is addressed to the individual as if we operate as individuals. But as we know from recent trends in democratic theory, people tend to think and form opinions as groups. So as soon as we stop addressing groups and stop addressing individuals and start addressing groups and being realistic about the fact that we basically grow in this intersubjective space, I think the closer we'll be to identifying sort of effective and workable solutions for changing our politics. And so I think the consciousness raising group is like clearly a tool in the service of that end.
Yeah, that's right. I think we need something that both honors our individuality and the context in which individuals live. So what is the role of these social tools in building just futures for ourselves? Can we use these kinds of circles for helping us not only situate ourselves in the historical past, but also to carve a path forward? And if so, to what and where are we striving? So just to kick off our discussion, I just want to share the writing prompt for one of our research tracks, which is called Beyond Identity. We've been doing a sort of bunch of reading groups to try and work out what a sort of identity politic that might get us towards just futures might look like. So Beyond Identity calls us to reflect on the following. How do we become the people that we need to be to earn ourselves a place at the interspecies transplanetary table of the future? If identity politics serves to reveal to us interlocking historical oppressions and how they shape the present, what parallel kinds of identities do we need to get us out of the past and into the future? Rosa Braidotti says, not all of us can say with any degree of certainty that we have always been human, or that we are only that. Some of us are not even considered fully human now, let alone at previous moments of Western social, political, and scientific history, end quote. So how do we become the people that we need to be? Mark Fisher talks about how the present day future has been eroded by the past, that we are in a slowing down or reversal of time where we cannot conceive of anything other than that which we have. That we, in the 21st century, attract living 20th century culture distributed through high-speed broadband from inside a capitalist cyberculture in which the future is cancelled. How then to change ourselves so as to open up the future for generations to come? What futuristic, experimental, and emancipatory identities can we anchor ourselves in relationship to that can ensure the future is not only possible, but goes beyond history? How can we navigate given that our affect and libidinal drives seek out the past instead of embracing the unknown? How can we make a decision to collectively heal from intergenerational trauma of the past, whilst acknowledging and fighting against the harms that are ongoing and unraging? We seek identities that cultivate nostalgias for the future, over a yearning for the past.
So I think this sort of leads into the series of the original Salon questions that we wanted to ask that were in the prompt, and maybe adds another one to them. So how might we revive the consciousness raising group? So what kind of form might it take in the 21st century? How might we approach healing ourselves and the world at the same time? Is there a way to make mutual support circles a common feature of people's lives? Maybe strategizing how to popularize the consciousness raising group. Is there a better term we might use for these kinds of groups today? Can online tools like Zoom, Facebook groups, Web4, et cetera, aid in consciousness raising? And then I guess the additional question that Zarina is sort of posing here, like, how can we think of the consciousness raising group as being sort of oriented toward producing a future oriented subjectivity, right? I don't know if there's any other questions you or anyone else wants to add to that, but.
No, that's great.
No.
I will. How do people feel? So would you rather have this discussion without streaming? Zoe doesn't mind.
I don't mind.
You don't mind? Does anyone
mind
feel like they would speak more freely if we weren't streaming?
I'm afraid to say that I would, sadly.
Great. Okay, I'm just going to stop then. Oh man.
Dang. Just kidding.
Stop live stream.
But,
Okay.
but if there are those who would like it to be streamed, then I will just speak less freely. It's fine.
No. Okay. Bye, internet.
Bye, YouTube.